that's the highly concentrated power system within the private sector. So in fact, it's a transfer of power from the state system, where there's whatever degree of participation there may be, you know, a lot in some countries, less in other countries, but some degree of participation, and in principle, a lot of participation, in fact, full participation in principle. There's a transfer from that system to a system of unaccountable private power, where in principle there is no participation. So you and I, in principle, have nothing to say about the decisions of General Electric and Microsoft. You know, that's a matter of law and principle. Unless you happen to own some stock, then you have as much say as the stock you own, which means if you're in the top few percentage of the population, you own most of the stock and you have most of the say. But there isn't even in principle, and these are unaccountable also. You also can't find out what they're doing. Like you can't find out the books of General Electric. That's a secret. So these are unaccountable private power. Internally, they're essentially totalitarian. If you take a look at the structure of a corporation, it's about as close to the totalitarian model as anything human beings have devised, you know, with power vested at the top, orders going down stage by stage. If you're a middle-level manager, say, you take your orders from above and you hand them down below, as in totalitarian systems, say Stalinist Russia, there's some interaction, you know, like nothing's totally rigid, and other influences, but it's, as I say, about as close to the totalitarian ideal as humans have constructed, and unaccountable, and that's where that's where decisions are transferred. So to the extent that these processes are taking place, yeah, it's an attack on democracy, virtually by definition, and the efforts to move things in that direction are an attempt to increase that. But even beyond that, let's just take a look at democracy within the state sector, so formal democracy like voting rights and that kind of thing. Here it's a mixed story. So take the regions where the U.S. has been influential. That's primarily the Western Hemisphere. That's the place to look to check the theory that there's been a victory for democracy. We've been trying to contain threats to it. Now we enlarge its scope. So we can look at the Western Hemisphere. Well, that's been studied rather well. There's good scholarship on it. The best scholarly work on the topic is, the most extensive, and it's good, is by Thomas Carruthers, who's a Latin American specialist, who has the advantage of also writing from an insider's perspective, because he was in the Reagan administration in the State Department, working on democracy enhancement programs. That was the period of the great victory of democracy in Latin America. He was working on it in the middle, and he's now writing about it as a scholar. And his review, I think, is basically accurate. He points out that there indeed was an increase in democracy, formal democracy in Latin America, and it was in inverse correlation to U.S. influence. That is, the greater the U.S. influence, the less the increase in democracy. So there was an increase in democracy in the southern cone, you know, South America, like Argentina, Brazil, Chile. The Reagan administration opposed it, but once it proved irresistible, they sort of went along with it and, in fact, even took credit for it. So in the regions of the least influence, there was an extension of democracy. In the regions of the most influence, which is nearby, you know, the traditional area of U.S. domination, the Caribbean, Central America, that's where there was least increase in democracy. There were formal democracies, but as Carruthers puts it, I'll quote him, the United States would only tolerate top-down forms of democracy, of democratic change, that maintained the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied, and maintained the basic order of fundamentally of quite undemocratic societies. Yeah, that's correct. If you look closely at the region, you'll find out that that's what happened. So yes, there was a kind of a victory of democracy, which was substantial in the regions of less U.S. influence, was less in the regions of more U.S. influence, and in fact maintained the structures of the undemocratic societies in the same power systems, crucially. That was a crucial part of the move toward democracy. I think you find, again, an internal analog to that. Come back to it if there's time. The model that was given when Anthony Lake announced the Clinton doctrine, the great new doctrine, he gave an example, a prize example, to illustrate how it was going to work, the new victories of markets and democracies. The example he gave was Haiti. And it's a good example because the recent developments there are post-Cold War, so one can't give any arguments about this was a reflection of the Cold War or whatever. Actually, I don't think those arguments work very well for earlier periods either, but here the question is moot because the events in question are after the end of the Cold War. And Haiti was offered as the example of our achievements and the promise of bringing democracy and markets to a benighted world. So that's a good one to look at. And then when you look at it, you find it illustrates all the phenomena I've just been describing quite accurately, I think. There was a democratic election, first democratic election in Haiti in 1990. The United States did not oppose it. The United States had its own candidate, Marc Bazin, a World Bank official, and it took for granted, everyone took for granted he was going to win. He had all the resources, he had all the rich people working for him, and so on, so everyone figured he'd be a shoo-in. So that looked like an okay election, maintained the top-down structure of power. Well, to everyone's surprise, he didn't win. In fact, he got smashed. He got 14% of the vote, and 2/3 of the vote went to a candidate nobody thought about, namely Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was supported by something that no one had noticed, namely a huge popular grassroots movement in the peasant society and the urban slums. Nobody pays any attention to those people, but they had been developing lively organizations and grassroots movements and so on, and a very vibrant civil society, sufficient so they even swept their own president into office with 2/3 of the vote and no resources. That's pretty remarkable. In fact, that is probably the most dramatic victory of democracy in the Western Hemisphere in quite a long time. In fact, maybe ever, you could argue. Or not just the Western Hemisphere. It was a pretty dramatic event, rarely takes place. And that was an election, real democratic election, post-Cold War. The United States did react. It was extremely hostile. The United States moved at once to undermine the democratic government, cut off aid, except for opponents of the president, supported business elements that were trying to undermine him. This is despite the fact that his policies were quite successful. In fact, mildly reformist policies, so successful that even the World Bank and the IMF were impressed and were giving loans and so on, but the United States was dedicated to undermining it. You could see the dedication rather strikingly by looking at refugee policy, which is quite revealing in this case. During the period of the brutal dictatorship that the U.S. had backed, there was an enormous flow of refugees from Haiti. People were fleeing from terror and poverty. They were turned back by force, illegally. This is in radical violation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but the Carter administration and the Duvalier dictatorship made an agreement, which was then extended by Reagan, to forcefully return people fleeing from Haiti and not to grant them asylum. And that continued until the democratic election. At that point, the refugee flow stopped, virtually stopped. There was just a trickle. And in fact, it reversed because people started going back. Haitians started returning in this period of hopefulness. U.S. refugee policy also reversed. It reversed towards granting asylum to refugees. In fact, asylum requests were granted at 50 times the rate during the democratic interlude as before, because now they were fleeing a democratic government, not a murderous dictatorship, so therefore they were real political refugees. A couple of months later, just to dramatize the fact, a few months later there was a military coup. President Aristide was overthrown. U.S. refugee policy reversed. Now people were again fleeing from brutal terror. It was pretty bad. I was there for a little while myself, but you have to be there to know how bad it was. It was awful. People were fleeing from poverty, terror, torture, and they were forced back. The United States imposed, and again, obviously, illegal blockade to force them back, and that's still going on. couple hundred were just forced back a few weeks ago. Well, that symbolizes what happened. When the military coup took place, the United States made the right noises. It was the Bush administration about saying how bad this is and we're in favor of democracy, but they moved at once to support the military coup. The Organization of American States called an embargo. The U.S. instantly undermined it. Within a few weeks, President Bush had exempted U.S. firms from the embargo. So the embargo was fine, but U.S. firms were not going to participate. The U.S. maintained connections with the high military officers, kept training them, kept relationships with them, had them on their biggest killers on the payroll. We don't know the details of this. The reason we don't know the details is that when U.S. troops were finally sent in, they stole all the documents and are refusing to release them or to give them back to the government of Haiti. There are now still 160,000 pages of documents about terror, torture, relations with the U.S. That the U.S. simply refuses to release. Human Rights Watch, which has seen some of them, says that they're being withheld because they would have embarrassing revelations about U.S. relations with the terror and torture. Since they're not available, I can't guess, so you make your own guess. But the connections are clear, as is the training and so on. Furthermore, the embargo went, undermining the embargo went far beyond exempting U.S. firms. When Clinton came in fact, the embargo was further undermined. So U.S. trade with Haiti went up under Clinton during the period of the terror. But more strikingly, both the Bush and the Clinton administrations secretly authorized the Texaco Oil Corporation to ship oil to the military junta. Now, oil is the centerpiece of any embargo. No society is going to run if it doesn't have energy, and they're running on oil. Everyone in Haiti could see that oil was coming in. Like the rich families were building big oil farms and that sort of thing. But theoretically, it wasn't coming in. The CIA was testifying to Congress that it had been cut off. It was plainly coming in, and in fact, the day before the U.S. troops landed, it was revealed, a major story on Associated Press, major leak from the Justice Department, that both the Bush and the Clinton administrations had in fact informed the Texaco Oil Company that shipments of oil would be illegal, but that they wouldn't do anything about it. So in other words, go ahead. So oil went in. In fact, there was no embargo. After the population had been subjected to 3 years of terror and torture in the expectation that the popular civil society would be wiped out, or intimidated at least, U.S. troops did go in to restore democracy. What they restored was the policies of the candidate who had lost the election in 1990. Our President Aristide was allowed to return, but on condition, explicit condition, that he accept a social and economic program written in Washington, which the core element of which was that the resources of the reconstituted government would have to be directed primarily to civil society, particularly the private sector, both native and foreign. So spell that out. The private sector, native, means the rich folk up in the hills who were supporting the military coup. They get the resources, and of course investors in the United States. So investors in New York are Haitian civil society, but not the peasants in the hills or the people in the slums of Port-au-Prince. They're not Haitian civil society. And that's the policy, and that's what's been imposed. If you look at the economic, in fact, that is the program of the U.S. candidate in 1990 who lost. This is being offered, remember, as the great victory for democracy and markets, which I'll come to. These programs are very carefully, in fact, again, it's not particularly a secret, like Strobe Talbot, the State Department representative, when he testified to Congress, Congress was concerned that the U.S. might lose control of Haiti, after troops withdraw and so on. He said, no, we will not lose control. We'll still be able to control Haiti through U.S. aid and the private sector. So don't worry about it. It's under control, democracy. The economic policies are are picking up again from what they were in the 80s. Haiti had been subjected to very strict, what are called neoliberal policies, Washington consensus policies in the 1980s, U.S. 80s, as before, in fact. U.S. aid, the U.S. had declared that these policies were going to be, create an economic miracle, that Haiti was going to become the Taiwan of the Caribbean. That's what they predicted, knowing perfectly well that Taiwan had followed a radically different course. They couldn't have failed to know that. But Haiti had all the proper solutions, open up your markets, cut traffic, tariffs, privatize, get rid of the state, all these good things. And they did. And in fact, it was economically successful for civil society in the U.S. sense, that is, the private sector, both native and foreign. On the other hand, wages declined about 50%, malnutrition increased, suffering increased, and so on. That was, and Haiti remained Haiti, not Taiwan. In fact, became more so. Well, now there's been an interlude. The policies are being picked up again. There's plenty of aid going in, but very carefully directed. For the overwhelming majority of the population, their livelihood depends on agriculture and handicrafts. Nothing is going to that. There's no aid for those things. Aid is going to the export sector, the assembly plants, kind of maquilas, the foreign-owned assembly plants, where they pay ridiculous wages. I mean, indescribably low wages, have horrendous working conditions, mostly women. They get subsidies. As does the agro-export sector, which is mostly plantations and so on, but not the sector in which the people work. They don't get any subsidies. So there's cheap subsidized electricity, say, for agro-export and industry, but not for the population. They don't get it because that would be price control, and we're opposed to that in principle, at least for poor people. Before these reforms began, Haiti was producing virtually all of its rice domestically. It's the main subsistence food, and that has a lot of interaction with the rest of the economy. So rice production means processing and commerce and all sorts of other stuff. So that was a core part of the economy. By now, after the reforms, the neoliberal reforms, it's down to 50% and declining, with the obvious effects on the rest of the economy. The Haitian rice producers are supposed to open themselves up to foreign competition. That's kind of good for you because, it leads to efficiency and the market and all that sort of thing. But there's a little footnote there. They're opening themselves up to competition with highly subsidized U.S. rice producers, whose subsidies, in fact, went up sharply under the Reagan years as part of the radical attack on markets during the Reagan years. To the point where by 1987, U.S. rice producers were getting about 40% of their income just from government subsidies. And Haitian peasants are supposed to compete with them because the market is such a wonderful thing and good for you and so on and so forth. Well, remember, I didn't pick this example. This is the example that's chosen to be the prize example of the victory of markets and democracy. And in fact, it tells you a lot. It tells you a lot about markets. Market discipline is for poor people. Not for rich people. They need the protection of the nanny state and get it. Democracy is okay as long as but it's not assessed by process. It's assessed by outcome. So it comes out the way we want, leaving top-down societies with the power structure intact, then it's okay. But if it comes out the wrong way, like if the wrong people happen to organize and develop their own policies and programs, then no good. Then you have one or another method to get rid of it. Well, I think that's what we really find when we look at the examples that were chosen, and they're revealing. Let's look a little further at democracy. There's a long tradition of American democracy, and it's worth remembering what it was. The United States is the country to look at if you want to understand what modern industrial democracy means. It is, it's fair to call it the most free country in the world, the most democratic country in the world. It has the most stable, long-standing democratic institutions. They go way back. They've been resilient and so on. So it's about as good a model of the ideal case, if you like, of capitalist industrial democracy, and therefore worth studying quite carefully. I mean, quite apart from the fact that we happen to live in it, so we're interested, and it's by far the most powerful country in the world, so it matters a lot what it's like. And it's an interesting history. You should study about it, in my view, in junior high school, but at least in, graduate school political science courses, but it's not really much study. The place to look at the nature of American democracy, the obvious place to look, is in the Constitutional Convention. The debates on the Constitutional Convention, which laid out the framework of what became American democracy, and they're interesting. They're not much read. What people usually read is the Federalist Papers. I'm sure you've read those. But the Federalist Papers are a misleading source. The Federalist Papers were propaganda, remember. They were written in order to convince the public, who didn't like what was happening much, to convince them to accept the new constitutional system. So when you read the Federalist Papers, you're reading a kind of a watered-down version, a prettified version of the thinking that was going on. In the debates on the Constitutional Convention, it's much clearer, and they're interesting. The main framer, as you know, was James Madison, who was at the sort of libertarian end and a very intelligent and lucid analyst and exponent of his views, and his views largely prevailed. I mean, there was very little opposition to them at the end. He was quite clear on what he was doing. The model that everyone had in mind, of course, is England. That was the most democratic existing society of the day, so they were sort of, and the one, their mother country. So they're asking, well, what about the British parliamentary system? And there were debates about whether to accept it or modify it or whatever. Madison pointed out that the British system would have problems if they transferred it over here, and that is because the United States, they did want to make it, he and the other founding fathers, as they're called, did want to make it a more participatory and democratic society. But he said a democratic society has a serious flaw. The flaw is that in a democratic society, the people can participate. And he said, suppose this were to take place in England. Suppose, for example, in England, that they really allowed people to vote, which they didn't. He said, well, the first thing people would do would be to call for what we nowadays call agrarian reform. That is, they would call for changes in the land laws, which would grant more people access to the highly privatized and centralized land system. And that, land was a crucial part of the economy then. And he says, well, we obviously can't accept that. We don't want to have any system that will allow people to participate and infringe on the rights of private property and wealth. So therefore, we have to be careful not to allow a democratic system in which things really function democratically. We have to design a system in which power is in the hands of the wealth of the nation, I'm quoting, the more capable set of men, those who are sympathetic with the rights of property. Okay, they must have the power, and the rest must be dispersed and factionalized in such a way that they don't really interfere with the rights of power. Actually, Madison, who was no fool, recognized that this problem was going to become greater as time went on. As he put it, if I can read my own notes, he said there's going to be an increase in the proportion of the population that labors under all the hardships of life and secretly sighs for a more equal distribution of its blessings. Okay, there's going to be an increase in that, and if those people really have an ability to participate, they're going to do things which will infringe on the right of private power and private property on the wealthy, and therefore we have to design the system so that doesn't happen. And indeed, the system was designed so that that wouldn't happen. That was the role of the Senate, was to represent the wealth of the nation, and the role of the separation of powers, and so on and so forth. How well it functioned, you can argue. It's an interesting question, but it's worth noticing that this idea about the nature of democracy has this problem in the nature of democracy, that namely if people can vote, they're going to vote in their own interests. and infringe on the rights of private power and wealth. That insight goes way back, goes back to the origins of political theory. So you read the first major book on political theory in something like our sense, Aristotle's Politics. That's a core question of Aristotle's Politics. Aristotle distinguishes tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, and has a long, elaborate discussion of each, and favors democracy. He didn't think it was perfect, but he favored democracy as the best system. For him, a democracy was very straightforward. It meant a community of equals, or to be precise, free men who are equals. And that phrase, free men, is rather crucial, but put that aside for a moment. A community of free men who are equal and participatory. Unless it's equal, and they can't be seriously participatory, he noticed the same problem that Madison did. Exactly the same problem. He said, suppose that you did have a democracy where everyone participated, but you had radical inequality, so concentration of wealth. He said, well, then the poorer part of the population, which is the majority, will use their voting power for their own interests, to advance their own interests, instead of the common good of all. Okay? And the goal of a democracy for Aristotle was to advance the common good of all. But if you had inequality, radical inequality, well, yeah, the majority of the population would vote for their own interests, which would not be the common good of all. So therefore, he had to do something about that. It's the same problem that Madison faced, exactly the same problem, but they reached opposite conclusions. Madison's conclusion was that we should reduce democracy so that you don't get the threat from the population. Aristotle's was the opposite. You should reduce inequality. So therefore the problem won't arise, and you could have a real participatory democratic system. So Aristotle called for what we today would call a welfare state. He said that a democracy must be based on use of public revenues to ensure lasting prosperity for everyone. Welfare state, in other words. And then he describes in some detail how you could proceed to do that in Athens. Do it differently here, but the same kinds of questions. And then if everyone had moderate but sufficient income, you wouldn't have this problem that both he and Madison faced. But notice that their choices were radically different. One choice was to aim for equality and participation in democracy. The other, the one on which our country was founded, was to reduce the threat of democracy, maintain the inequality, and ensure that power remains in the Senate, the capable class of men, the wealthy part of the wealthy part of the society. That's now internationalized. So this huge financial capital that's flowing around the world is sometimes called by international economists a virtual Senate, meaning it has the power to ensure, if you really liberalize capital, to ensure that no country will be able to undertake social policies that strike at the interests of the wealthy. Because if any country moves in that direction, the capital quickly flows out of it and the country goes down the tube. So it's a virtual Senate, kind of a generalization of Madison's Senate. And the opposite of the Aristotelian conception of democracy is necessarily based on a welfare state and equality. To go back to that word free men, a democracy for Aristotle meant men, not women, and free, not slaves, or aliens. So it's a subpart of the population, but it's a little hard to dump on Aristotle for that, since given that those questions weren't even addressed, and badly addressed, until this century, and still are far from addressed.